So, what is your field, and how was your field when you started?
So I was trained as a modern European intellectual historian, and I really was trained to focus on French, German, Italian philosophy, other kinds of thought in the 19th and 20th centuries. I've kind of gotten less interested in my home field over time, so I've moved more in the direction of histories of political and legal thought, and transatlantic affairs. So I did a law degree, and I've recently tried to work on the history of human rights, which is not a topic that would have been central to the field in which I was trained. But I still consider myself a European intellectual historian most of the time.
And how did you see the future development of your field when you started?
I think it seemed fairly stable, because in our universe in the United States, the disciplines seem fairly set. At maybe for a brief period, it seemed so to someone like me entering the historical profession in the 1990s. In the United States, my field, it exists, but really doesn't have an equivalent in France, say, because much of what we do is typically assigned to philosophy departments. But in the U.S., the kinds of things we study, philosophers, treat mostly with contempt. So we had a fairly stable platform on which to do our work. I think that the big change in the field is a general decline of interest in, let's say, European traditions of philosophy, including across the humanities. And so the rest of the disciplines have become a lot more like philosophy in that regard. And many of us have become interested in the kind of doing the histories of more dominant sorts of conceptions and ideas, hence the rise of international law, which would have been treated as a backwater field, or the history of the law of war, on which I've worked, and we've been at a conference together. When I was in law school, it was treated as really quite unimportant, whereas after, let's say, especially after 2001, but with the rhetoric of globalization, even before that, these fields started to become much more important, and many historians like me tried to do work in the history of international law just to find out where this thing had come from.
And how would you like your field developing?
So, I mean, this is a bit of almost a proverb, or in the United States. I don't know if it is here, but everyone speaks about becoming interdisciplinary in the United States. But it's something in which I have some interest. So it turned out that when I wrote a book about the history of human rights, and then on the basis of this started to talk to colleagues in especially anthropology, but also literary studies, and discovered that they had been really working on these things much longer than historians, and in very interesting ways. So a group of us, just to give an example, founded a journal a couple of years ago that's an interdisciplinary journal concerned with human rights, humanitarianism, and development. And it's quite unusual, I think, and not something I was particularly trained to do, to try to understand and judge the quality, say, of contributions that anthropologists might contribute, or that literary critics might contribute. And for other people involved in the journal, say, thinking about history as practiced by professionals, or thinking about the law is something they would like to do, but they haven't really been exposed to it in their formation. So the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity is a bit hackneyed, or kind of very, very much kind of repetitious, but it can have a reality. So I'd say that that's been probably the biggest, let's say, the biggest opening of in the last few years that I've seen in my own work.
Academia has actually evolved rather quickly over the last 10 years, and there are more and more faculty, students and faculty exchange. Actually, Columbia has a program
That's
with
right.
with Sciences Po,
Right.
and NYU has now a campus in Abu Dhabi. And
Yes. Yeah.
how do you see the future of academia, and what would you like see happening in academia
Right.
in the
Right.
future?
Right. Well, it's obviously a really interesting subject. NYU in the United States has by far taken the lead. The Columbia president, whose name is Lee Bollinger, really since he came to the campus about 10 years ago now, has always talked, about the global university. And I think there's a lot of unclarity about what that means. The NYU model seems to be to go beyond Europe, which is, I think, very salutary, because there are lots of, academic relationships and institutional relationships prior, during the Cold War, for example, with Europe and the United States. But it seems to have done so by establishing outposts of the American university, frequently funded by wealthy local potentates. Columbia has done a bit of that, but not tried to establish foreign campuses. We've tried to establish these global centers. No one's really sure what that means. There's a traditional center called Reed Hall that Columbia has here, where I spent a year. It was at that time an Institute for Scholars, which they're trying to reinvent. But they've also started several other global centers from scratch. And I would say in similar kinds of relationships as you'd find in the NYU scenario. And to me, the desirable thing would be to have much more student interchange. The fact is that these sorts of moves towards the global university don't seem to me to be leading very far in the direction of having foreign students at American universities, except for those who are children of very wealthy families. Even though it's pursued the global university, I think all American universities have also responded to the downturn economically by having a strategy of inviting foreigners who can pay our very large tuition bills to campus. And it doesn't seem to me that there's a great deal of intellectual globalization that's involved. There may be a globalization of elites, which itself has a history, but in the journal I mentioned, we've tried to get participation from African academics and Southeast Asian academics who frequently approach problems from a very different way, although of course they tend to be more aware of transatlantic academic traditions than we are of theirs. But that in addition to kind of more robust student interchange seems very promising.
And what should be the specific role of the humanities in this global world of academia?
Well, that's difficult to say. I don't have a very smart answer. I'd say that the disciplines that have succeeded in globalizing tend to be ones that have, let's say, more easily communicable languages, whether that's mathematics or natural sciences, or methods like economics that tend to be more portable. And it's also the case that people around the world are most interested in learning these languages because they seem to be valuable, and also be valuable in the very mercenary sense of launching a career. So I think you know, in the transatlantic world, the humanities have always relied on the generosity of these other fields to have a presence. And I think as of now, that generosity doesn't seem to be continuing. Of course, in the very old days, the humanities were really the core. And at Columbia, I still teach something that's called the core curriculum. That's philosophy and literature that dates from World War One and that we're preserving. But it seems to me in the global university, the core has shifted very far in the direction of natural sciences, but especially economics and business. And that might be fine. And people vote with their feet and want these sorts of knowledge. But it seems to me that they ought to bring along with them the other sorts of knowledge. I don't know exactly, for example, in Abu Dhabi, what the students are required to learn, whether they have a robust humanities curriculum, for example. I mean, I know people who are humanities professors who have visited that campus and have taught students. But it seems to me that, you know, the transatlantic university stands for, in part for not just natural scientific and economic knowledge, but also other kinds of knowledge, which it should be prioritizing and making part of these new moves.